I just wanted to know if you have any thoughts on recent NATO actions.
Recent
NATO actions and the protests coming up at the 60th NATO conference. I know you're speaking of the counter conference.
Could be. I give so many talks I can't remember. On the NATO conference? Well, I mean, the obvious question is, why should NATO exist? In fact, you can ask questions about why it should ever have existed, but now, why does it exist? I mean, the theory was, whether you believe it or not, that it would be a defensive alliance against potential Soviet aggression. That's the basic doctrine. Well, there's no defense against Soviet aggression, so whether you believe that doctrine or not, that's gone. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there had been an agreement, a recent agreement, between Gorbachev and the U.S. government, then the first Bush administration. The agreement was that Gorbachev agreed to a quite remarkable concession. He agreed to let a united Germany join NATO, a hostile military alliance. Now, that is remarkable in the light of history of the past century. Germany alone had virtually destroyed Russia twice, and Germany, backed by a hostile military alliance centered in the most phenomenal military power in history. That's a real threat. Nevertheless, he agreed, but there was a quid pro quo, namely that NATO should not expand to the east, so Russia would at least have a kind of a security zone. And George Bush and James Baker, as Secretary of State, agreed that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. Gorbachev also proposed a nuclear-free weapons zone in the region, but the U.S. wouldn't consider that. Okay, so that was the basis on which then, shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed, well, Clinton came into office. What did he do? One of the first things he did was to back down on that promise and expand NATO to the east. Well, that's a significant threat to the Soviet Union, to Russia. Now there was no longer any Soviet Union. It's a significant threat to Russia, and not surprisingly, they responded by beefing up their offensive capacity. Not much, but some. So they rescinded their pledge not to use nuclear weapons in first strike. NATO had never rescinded it, but they had, and started some remilitarization. With Bush, the aggressive militarism of the Bush administration, as predicted, induced Russia to extend further its offensive military capacity. It's still going on right now. When Bush proposed missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, Poland and Czechoslovakia, that was a real provocation to the Soviet Union. I mean, that was even discussed in U.S. arms control journals, that they would have to regard it as a potential threat to their strategic deterrent, meaning as a first strike weapon. And the claim was it had to do with Iranian missiles, but yeah, forget about that. And they say it's on to Obama. Obama's national security advisor, James Jones, former Marine commandant, is on record as favoring expansion of NATO to the south and the east, further expansion of NATO, and also making it basically an intervention force. And the head of NATO, Hoop de Scheffer, he has explained that NATO must take on responsibility for ensuring the security of pipelines and sea lanes. That is, it must guarantee, NATO must be a guarantor of energy supplies for the West. Well, that's kind of an unending war. So do we want NATO to exist? Do we want that to be, there to be a Western alliance, military alliance that carries out these activities with no pretense of defense, except, well, I think that's a pretty good question. I don't see any reason why it should. anymore. There happens to be no other military alliance even remotely comparable, but if there were one, I'd be opposed to that too. So I think the first question is, what is this all about? Why should we even be debating NATO? Is there any reason why it should exist?
We've seen mass strikes in countries all around the world, in Europe, places we wouldn't expect it normally. Do you think this is a revival of the left in the West, or do you think it's nothing?
It's really hard to tell. There's certainly signs of it in the United States, too. In fact, we had a sit-down strike in the United States not long ago, which is a very militant labor action. The sit-down strikes, which began at a significant level in the 1930s, were very threatening to management and ownership, because a sit-down strike is one step before taking over the factory and having the workers taking over the factory and running it and kicking out the managers and probably doing a better job. But that's a frightening idea, and police were called in and so on. We've just had one in the United States in the Republic plant. Hard to know. These things are just hard to predict. They may take off. They may take on a broader scope, or they may be fizzle away or be diverted.
Obama has said he's going to halve the budget. Do you think it's a little reminiscent of Clinton right before he decided to institute welfare reform, basically destroying half of the welfare system in this country? I think Obama's going to take the same course.
There's nothing much in his budget to suggest otherwise. For example, he didn't really say much about it, about the welfare system, but he did indicate that they're going to have to reconsider Social Security, for example. Well, there's nothing much about Social Security that needs reconsideration. It's in pretty good financial shape, probably as good as it's been in its history. It's pretty well guaranteed for decades in advance. As long as any of the famous baby boomers are around, Social Security will be completely adequate. So it's not for them, contrary to what's being said. If there is a long-term problem, which there probably is, there are minor adjustments that could take care of things. So why bring up Social Security at all? If it's an issue at all, it's a very minor one. I suspect the reason for bringing it up is that Social Security is regarded as a real threat by power centers, not because of what it does. It's very efficient, low administrative costs, but for two reasons. One reason is that it helps the wrong people. It helps mostly poor people and disabled people and so on. So that's kind of already wrong, even though it has regressive tax. But I think a deeper reason is that Social Security is based on an idea that power centers find extremely threatening, namely solidarity, concern for others, community, and so on. The fundamental idea of Social Security is that we care about whether, say, the disabled widow across town has food to eat. And that kind of idea has to be driven out of people's heads. If people have a commitment to solidarity, mutual aid, support, and so on, that's dangerous, because that can lead to concern for other things. Like, it's well known, for example, that markets just don't provide lots of options, and options which today are crucial options. So, for example, a market system permits you to decide whether to buy one brand of car or another. But the market doesn't permit you to decide, I don't want a car, I want a public transportation system. That's just not a choice made available on the market. And the same is true of a wide range of other matters of social significance, like whether to help the disabled widow across town. Okay, that's what that's what communities decide. That's what democracy is about. That's what social solidarity is about, mutual aid and building institutions by people for the benefit of people. And all of that threatens, the system of domination and control right at its heart. So there's a constant attack on Social Security, even though the pretexts are not worth paying attention to. And there are other questions in the budget. So, for example, there's a slight, the budget is called redistributive. Very marginally it is so. But the way it's redistributive, to the extent that it is by slightly reducing slightly increasing the tax responsibility of the extremely wealthy, top couple of percent, and the increase is very marginal. Doesn't get anywhere near back to what it was during the periods of high growth rate and so on. But that is slightly redistributive. But there are other ways to be redistributive, which are more effective. For example, allowing workers to unionize. It's well known that where workers are allowed to unionize, and most of them want to, that does lead to better wages, better working conditions, better benefits, and so on, which is distributive. It also helps turn working people into more of a political force. Instead of being atomized and separated, they're together. They can work together in principle. And not that unions function so wonderfully, but at least it's a move in that direction. And there is a potential legislation on the table that would help unionize, the Employee Free Choice Act, which Obama has said he's in favor of, but there's nothing about it in the budget. In fact, there's nothing in the budget at all, as far as I know, about improving opportunities to unionize, which is an effective redistributive goal. And there are other questions, too. There's a debate right now, happens to be in this morning's papers, you can look at it, about whether Obama's being accused, even by Democrats, in fact, particularly by Democrats, of taking on too much. Well, actually hasn't taken on very much, because the stimulus package, anybody would try to work out, maybe with one variation or another. And the same with the bailouts, which you can like or not, but any president was going to do it. But what is claimed is that he's adding on to it healthcare reform, which will be very expensive, another hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's just not the time to do that. Why would healthcare reform be more expensive? Well, it depends which options you pick. If the healthcare reforms maintain the privatized system, it's going to be very expensive because it's a hopelessly inefficient system. Very costly. Its administrative costs are far beyond Medicare, the government system. So what that means is, well, he's going to maintain a system which we know is inefficient, expensive, has poor outcomes, but is is a great benefit to insurance companies, financial institutions, pharmaceutical industry, and so on. So it's expensive. It doesn't have to be. It could save money. It could be a method of healthcare reform can be a method of deficit reduction, namely by moving to an efficient system that furthermore provides healthcare to everyone. But although that's talked about, it's kind of partially one of the options. It's on the margins, and the main advocates of it are not even included in the groups that are discussing it. And if you look through it case after case, there are a lot of questions like that. Take unionization again. This isn't in the budget, but take an example. Obama, a couple of months ago or weeks ago, wanted to make a gesture to show his solidarity with the labor movement, with workers. It's different with workers, not with the labor movement. And he went to visit an industrial plant in Illinois. The plant that he chose was Caterpillar. Now, there was some protest over that by human rights groups and the church groups and others because of Caterpillar's really brutal role in destroying what's left of Palestine. These are real weapons of mass destruction. And they're used that way. So there were protests, but he went anyway. However, there's a deeper issue which never even was raised, which is an interesting, and probably has been forgotten, which is an interesting comment on the nature of our ideological indoctrination. I mean, Caterpillar was the first industrial organization to resort to scabs, strikebreakers, to break a major strike. That was in the 1980s. It was Reagan had already opened the doors with the air controllers, but this is the first manufacturing industry to do it. Now, that hadn't been done in generations. And in fact, it was illegal in every industrial country except apartheid South Africa. But that was Caterpillar's achievement, helping to destroy the union by calling in scabs. And if you call in scabs, then forget about strikes, obviously, or any labor action. Well, that's the plant that Obama went to visit. Now, it's possible he didn't know, because the level of indoctrination in our society is so profound that most people wouldn't even know that. Still, I think it's instructive. If you're interested in doing something redistributive, you don't go to a plant that made labor history by breaking the principle that you can't break strikes with scabs.
My dad is a professor of health economics at Northwestern. We were arguing about something, I can't remember what. I told him that wages in the U.S. were much lower than most industrialized countries. And he said that it wasn't his fault that people decided to blow their paycheck on a big screen TV. I think that statement, in my mind, sums up how most elites feel about the poor. It's your fault you're poor. Do you agree with that?
Let's take a look at the post-war period. It's basically economic history of the post-war period. It breaks up roughly into two phases. The first phase was from the end of the war up till the early 70s. That's what many economists call the golden age of capitalism, state capitalism, they should say. It was a period in which there was unprecedented growth and very egalitarian growth. So wages rose. In fact, the lowest percentiles of the population did about as well as the upper ones. There were some level of social benefits were introduced, a partial welfare state, quality of life improved, social indicators improved. All that went on until about the mid-70s. Since then, the situation has been quite different. There was growth, though less than before, but it didn't go. But wages did not go up. Real wages stagnated pretty much for the majority of the population. Working hours went way up. You had to have two members of a family working just to keep food on the table, forgetting the flat screen television just for necessities. And that means that families are negatively affected unless there's support systems, which are very weak in the United States comparatively, daycare and so on and so forth. So it harmed families. Benefits declined, and quality of life indicators declined. In fact, the standard statistical indicators, social indicators, rose. They sort of tracked wages during the first period, but starting in 1975, wages roughly stagnated, real wages, and social indicators began to decline. Is that the fault of working people? Hardly. That's clearly the result of institutional changes and decisions about the structure of the economy, and we know what they were. That's when financialization of the economy began. Manic ideas about efficient markets took over. Regulation started being eliminated. Claims about reduction of government began to be popular. It didn't happen. Government grew under Reagan, but the claims and the attacks on the start of dismantling welfare state measures went on. Americans now work many more hours than the Europeans, and for at best, not even comparable wages. But is that are these changes the fault of the poor? I mean, it's pretty irrational. We know that major changes were made in the structure of institutions, and that led to dramatic outcomes. So it's irrational to say that's the fault of the individuals, the same individuals who were there in the Golden Age.
All right. Are you familiar with the book The Sane Society by Erich Fromm? Yeah. In the book, he's talking about the alienation of man and depression, capitalist society. I thought that was very relevant, still 50 years later today. Do you agree with that? And do you think there's anything we can do about that?
He didn't make it up, because Marx talked about it in the early manuscripts, and in fact, Fromm edited the early manuscripts and about alienation of labor and so on. He extended it. And Marx didn't invent it either. It comes out of the Romantic tradition in which he grew up, about how if people work at the command of others, their work and lives don't mean anything to them. If they create themselves, then it does mean something to them. It's the core of alienation. And it generalizes over the society when people are atomized, separated from one another, and so on. And I think that book must have been in the 50s. Yeah. And he was discussing a situation which was then developing after the Great War, Second World War and the Depression. That radicalized people. If you look at the public mood by the late 40s around the world, but in the United States too, it was pretty radical. There were pressures even for workers to take over industry and so on. And that caused real fear in the business community, which pretty much runs the country. And huge programs were initiated to try to drive the society back to obedience. Massive programs. This is pretty good scholarship on it. But captive audiences and factories were given lectures on what they call economics or Americanism and so on. They took over. They infiltrated churches, schools, sports leagues, almost anything you can think of. At the same time, a huge social engineering project was instituted, probably the biggest one in world history, I think bigger than anything Stalin contemplated, namely the suburbanization of America. It began with a literal conspiracy, sent to court, fined a couple $1,000 by General Motors, Firestone Rubber, and Standard Oil of California, who bought up the pretty efficient electric rail system in Los Angeles, and maybe all of California, at least Los Angeles, and converted it to use by trucks, buses, cars, and so on, obvious to their benefit. Disaster for Los Angeles, in my opinion, but anyway, that's what happened. They were taken to court for conspiracy and, fined enough for their victory dinner and celebration, I think. But and then it was picked up by the government, state and federal government. During the 50s, Eisenhower instituted something which Obama says he's taken as model, namely what's called the National Defense Highway System. If you carry out a government program, you have to put the word defense in there. Otherwise, people aren't going to pay for it. So the idea was, we'll transport missiles around the country or some lunatic notion like that. But it was simply a means. Along with that went the development of infrastructure for airports, air commerce, and so on. Well, and of course nothing for railroads. They are allowed to deteriorate. Well, the whole point of this is to create an economy based on fossil fuels, on individual automobiles, not public transportation, and also to spread the country out. Real estate laws were changed in the states so as sort of try to scatter the population, pretty much destroy the inner cities, scatter the population, arrange it so that where people live, they're going to have 2 cars because you have to get to the mall and you have to go to work and this, that, and the other thing. All right, it's a huge project. And one of the consequences is what Fromm called alienation. Communities are broken down. Natural entities are broken down. And people are out, kind of, in a way, impelled to be out for themselves. Then they're alienated from the surroundings. It leads to malaise of various kinds. And that's been, incidentally, I have nothing against suburbs. In fact, I live in one. It's very pleasant. But it does have these consequences. One of its consequences, which wasn't considered much in the 50s, is it's going to destroy the environment. But, so yes, the comments, both alienation and work of labor and of life, mean more now than they did then. Society is very atomized now. People feel alone. They feel helpless. It even shows up in polls. Like an astonishing 80% of the population think that the government does not work for the people. It works for a few big interests who are looking out for themselves. But they also feel they can do nothing about it. I mean, this even shows up in other things. Like a huge percentage of the population, I've forgotten the numbers, think that the Bush administration either was responsible for 9/11 or might have been responsible for it.
Really? A huge portion?
It's pretty high.
Wow.
I think it's over a third or something like that. A lot of people,
Wow.
But quite interestingly, they don't think there's anything they can do about it. Okay, so our government is a bunch of mass murderers who are trying to slaughter us, but what can I do? That's alienation carried out to an indescribable degree. People just feel helpless, hopeless. And you can understand why. You can't do anything as an individual, and you don't have any organizations. That's part of the reason for the intensity of the attack on unions. They really are instruments of democratization for workers' education, for exchanging ideas, for making plans, for entering into political action, and so on. I mean, I can remember from childhood, I grew up in the Depression as a kid, but my aunts are unemployed seamstresses and that sort of thing. But they had a union, and that was a center that their life turned around. Cultural life, even things like vacation, or some sense of unity. I mean, the slogan of the labor movement is solidarity, and the opposite of solidarity is alienation. So, these things, and it certainly has increased, and it's still increasing. So if you look at Obama's budget, there's a lot of money for infrastructure, but very little for, a little, but not much for mass transportation, which is essential, and almost nothing about trying to do something about reconstruction, social life to reverse the effects of these massive social engineering problems that are creating ecological disaster and alienation and so on.
Well, I live out in Georgia, and there's a lot of people I talk to who are ultra right-wing, Ron Paul libertarians. Is there any way for they're extremely cynical. Is there any way to reach out on the left? Is there any way to reach out and talk to them about trying to bring them over to the left?
Well, I think what you have to do is ask what makes them Ron Paul libertarians. And I don't happen to think that makes a lot of sense, but nevertheless, underlying it are feelings that do make sense. I mean, the feeling, for example, that the government is our enemy. Well, it's a very widespread feeling. And in fact, that's been induced by propaganda as well. So pretty soon it'll be April 15th, and the people in your neighborhood are going to have to send in their income taxes. The way they're going to look at it, and the way they've been trained to look at it, is that there's some alien force, like maybe from Mars, which is stealing our hard-earned money from us, namely the government. Okay, well, that would be true in a totalitarian state. But if you had a democratic society, you'd look at it the other way around. You say, great, it's April 15th. We're all going to contribute to implement the plans that we jointly decided on for the benefit of all of us. But that idea is even more frightening than Social Security. It means that we would have a functioning democracy, and no center of concentrated power is ever going to want that, for the obvious reasons. So yes, there's major efforts and pretty successful efforts to get people to fear the government as their enemy, not to regard it as as just the collective population acting in terms of common goals that we've decided on, which would happen in democracy, and is to an extent what does happen in functioning democracies like Bolivia, or a country in South America. Yeah, it's kind of what's happening there, more or less, but in very remote from here. So, well, I think Ron Paul supporters can be appealed to on these grounds. They're also against military intervention, and we can ask, okay, why? I mean, is it just for their own security, or because they want to be richer or something? Well, I doubt it. I think people are concerned that destroyed Iraq and so on. So I think there are lots of grounds for finding. There are lots of common grounds that can be explored, even if the outcomes at the moment look very different. They look different because they're framed within fixed doctrines, but those doctrines are not graven in stone. They can be undermined.
All right, well, Dr. Chomsky, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.